All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's another special day because we have the father of open innovation here today, and he doesn't need any introduction. We're excited about what he has to say about his new book. He's back from Europe, so he's a little bit under the weather, but he came anyway because he didn't want to disappoint all of you. So, Henry, thank you so much for coming. I sent around the attendance sheet. Make sure that you do sign your name and make sure that the email is correct so we can correspond. And the other thing is that I'll be emailing you some copies of some good write-ups we had, so you have a template to work from as to the expectations, because I think you need 2 write-ups to get 1 unit credit for this class. All right? Thank you. Henry?
I'm all mic'd up already. We'll take that for Q&A. Good afternoon. As Solomon said, I'm a little under the weather, so my apologies if my voice is not always as strong as it normally is. Has everybody gotten one of these? Has anybody not gotten one? Okay, so we have some extras here. So here, take one of these, gentlemen. This is how I find out who didn't get here on time. Okay. Who else needs one? All right. Hi, Antoine. How are you? Okay, very good. I'm also very pleased to just recognize in our audience today Jean-Paul Jacob from IBM Research, actually, because as it turns out, IBM Research is actually a part of the story I want to tell you this afternoon. And with Jean-Paul's help, I've gotten to know and to do some work with some of the folks there, and this is some of the fruits of those labors. So JP, it's particularly great that you're here this afternoon. And he also has to leave at 1:30, so it won't be because of his violent disagreement with anything I'm saying. It's just he has another commitment he has to get to. So let me start by building on top of the talk you heard last week from Joel West. How many of you were able to be here for Joel's talk? About half. So Joel went through an overview of open innovation. What I'm going to share with you is some research that's just coming out this week in this new book that sort of takes the concepts of open innovation but takes them into the services sector as well. So I will have a brief recap of a few points in open innovation, but for those of you who weren't here, all of the videos in the topics in open innovation classes are up on the website at openinnovation.haas.berkeley.edu. So it's a long one, but openinnovation.haas.berkeley.edu will get you to the Center for Open Innovation webpage. And here, Richard Henderson's here, who actually helps us get these videos up on the site, so you can go back and see anything you've missed. We're typically there. And how long does it take us from?
It's between 3 and 5 days for the video show.
We'll call it a week, just to give Richard a little slack there. So you can check out Joel's talk and see what he talked about. Because I'm going to go fast here. When we get to the Q&A, of course, you're welcome to ask me anything you want. But I decided I wouldn't put you through another presentation on open innovation, but rather give you some of the new stuff. So to begin, there have been 3 books that have kind of act as markers in the research program on open innovation. The first one came out in 2003, and at the time I wrote that book, I actually did a Google search on the term open innovation, and I got back about 200 page links. And these were things like Company X opened its innovation center at location Y. Just very descriptive. No, the term open innovation itself didn't really have any currency at that point. I did the same search last summer, and I got 13 million page links on Google. So in the space of 7 years, almost 6 orders of magnitude in change in the reaction to the term. And those page links, indeed, were about this new model of innovation. So that all started back in 2003. In that book, companies brought in ideas from outside or let internal ideas go to the outside based on their business model. The business model told them what to look for from the outside world they might want to bring in, and also identified things in the organization that weren't going to get through to the market that might be valuable to someone else in a different business model in their organization. But in the first book, the business model itself was relatively fixed. I began to think about, after that point, what if you could actually innovate the business model itself and change the way that you created value on the one hand and then captured a piece of that value on the other hand, which is a sort of a short working definition for the idea of a business model. So the 2006 book is about that. What if we can actually innovate the business model itself? And in this second book, there's also a lot about managing intellectual property, because a lot of the underpinnings of many business models have to do with intellectual property. And although there was some discussion of that in the first book, it was a much more central focus in the second book, including the insight that sometimes the best way to manage your IP is to publish it, put it out in the public domain. You may want to actually help create an intellectual commons in areas that feed into your business because it attracts more participation, much more variety, and although you don't win directly in that space, you can, for one thing, make sure nobody else wins in that space either, so you're playing for a tie rather than a win. And if you've got something adjacent to that that is profitable for you, the more people you bring to that, the more profitable it can be down the road. The third book takes these ideas from the products and technologies into the services side of the economy. And that's where I'll be focusing my talk today. But I just wanted you to see sort of the arc of where this is developed and where it's going. One of the motivations for open innovation in general, and for open innovation in services in particular, is what I regard as the increasing pressure on the economics of innovation. In some bygone time, you had a bunch of internal development costs that in turn unlocked a stream of revenues. And the way I've drawn this here, the stream of revenues more than covered the costs of doing it. So this was a profitable, attractive proposition, and companies would want to do more of this. But there's some forces that are hitting this that are really beginning to devalue that economic model. On the cost side, it's getting more and more expensive to innovate. And you can see this in consumer products, where the costs of launching brands, getting widespread distribution are growing and getting more expensive. Or in the semiconductor industry, where building a new fabrication facility has been steadily growing faster and faster and is now, by many estimates, $5 or $6 billion per fab, whereas 20 years ago you could have built a fab for $100 million. Or in pharmaceutical drug development, where 20 years ago estimates were it cost somewhere between $100 and $200 million to develop a new drug. More recent estimates put that between $1 to $2 billion per drug. So innovation in many areas is getting more expensive. Well, if that was all that was going on, as long as you could get a nice big stack of revenue on top of it, it would be a story of the big get bigger, and everybody else kind of gets pushed out. But that's actually not what's going on. There's a second force that makes it so that even the big companies can't play this game successfully either. And that is the shortening time in the market for these new products. I used to work in the disk drive industry, and in the 80s when I was there, we had to fight hard for a design win, but once we got a design win in one of our customers' systems, those systems would ship for 4 or 5 years. And so we'd get 4 or 5 years of revenues off of our efforts to get our product designed into that customer's system. By the time I left the industry in the mid-90s, that window had collapsed to about 6 months. And the cycle had just gotten faster and faster and faster. So you can think of this as a treadmill running at a higher and higher speed. And so in that industry, if you were even 2 months late with your design, the thing you had to do was skip it and go on to the next version because there was no profit left in the business. In the case of the drug industry, you can see these generics coming on stream right at the date that the patents expire, and they're able now to get in volume, get ramped, get distribution very quickly. So your revenues really fall off a cliff when your patent coverage expires in pharma now. The cell phone industry. How many of you have a cell phone that's more than 2 years old? Yeah, we just got our hands down. Yeah. It's amazing how quickly cell phones are changing. About every 4 months, there are new models coming out that are actually new features, new capabilities, new OSs. So even a 2-year-old cell phone can feel surprisingly archaic. I'll have more to say about cell phones in a minute. So the combination of this really creates some tension for sustaining investments in innovation because you spend more money with less time in the market. So it isn't just that the big get bigger and everybody else suffers, it's actually everybody's getting crushed by this. And it's creating what many people are calling a commodity trap. So now we get to the cell phone industry. This is the Motorola Razr. Anybody remember this? Way cool product in its time. Look at how thin that thing is. This was back in 2004. Motorola was the #1 handset manufacturer in the world. They sold more than 50 million of these. But today, Motorola is not the #1 manufacturer. They are, in fact, the world's #7 manufacturer today. Their follow-on product to the Razr, something called the Crazer, just didn't speak to us apparently, the same way the Razr did. Along comes Nokia riding GSM and blows right by poor Motorola. And they've got their own kind of cool clamshell kind of design. They also are very, very good at developing global manufacturing, global distribution, very strong presence in the emerging markets. And there are other entrants coming from both Korea and Taiwan, really creating more competition in this industry, probably helping to accelerate that timetable of faster and faster cycle time. And Motorola really sort of fell off. But Nokia is not out of the woods either, because they have done all these things well. But if you think about Nokia today, they just fired their CEO, brought in a new guy from Microsoft. They reported their earnings, which are down. Their market share is down. They're facing real pressures as well. And why is that? Because Nokia is in the, they pushed Motorola into the commodity trap, but then they got caught in it themselves. And in the case of Nokia, I think we can see that the basis of competition is actually shifting in the cell phone business, because it isn't anymore about having a better handset with a bigger screen or a longer battery life or a clearer signal. Those are all good things to have, but those don't win in the market now. What wins in the market are having all these applications and services that sit on top of the cell phones. So you folks with these really old phones out there, you're probably using your phones to make phone calls. That is so 20th century now. My daughters have cell phones, and I look at their cell phone bills. They hardly make any phone calls. It's all texting, it's all downloading, it's all viewing, it's games, all kinds of applications. Sometimes they're even buying avatars to play on the games and these things. There's a whole new set, it's a whole new basis of what's going on in the phone business. And so the people who are driving this today, and this is where Nokia is really having trouble, is Nokia is doing great with the handsets, but that's not who they're up against anymore. Now they're up against these system architects, like Research in Motion with BlackBerry, or Apple, or Google with Android. Even Microsoft's trying to get back in the game now. So even though Nokia is the #1 in units, they've lost their leadership in profits. And as I said earlier, their market share is trailing down. They fired their CEO, so they've got a real problem here. So how do you get out of this trap? Well, 2 answers to it. The first answer is open innovation, which you heard about last week. So here's where I'm giving you my brief recap of what Joel talked about for the full time. What do you do with rising costs? Well, if you open up, you can actually leverage and collaborate and share risks with others in your development process. And that can actually lower your fixed costs of development. Now, you do share some of the upside. This doesn't come for free. But it does give you more flexibility, Many people call this a more asset-efficient kind of an innovation model because you don't have to make as many upfront capital investments yourself. It also helps you get faster into the market because when you do these outside collaborations, you're often picking up technologies that have already undergone some level of development outside your organization. So they start working with you when they're already some ways down the road with you. And the blind alleys or dead ends that they went through to get to that happened before you were involved and aren't part of your interactions with them. So it not only can save costs, it can actually accelerate your time to market, which helps with that shortening life cycle problem and revenues in the market. But open innovation can also help on the revenue side. In addition to things you can sell into your own market, you can sometimes find licensing opportunities for your ideas and technologies for some other company to take into their market. So this is a case where one way of thinking about it is you're hiring their business model to commercialize your technology and you get some kind of a royalty for doing that. There may be other cases where there is no obvious business model for how else you might use this, so you may actually have to help create a venture or a spin-off to go find that business model. And sometimes that works, in which case you profit from it. Sometimes it doesn't, in which case your loss is limited to the technology or whatever resources you contribute at the founding of the spin-off. So these things can build new revenue streams while sharing and leveraging and lightening the asset burden of your development costs. And another thing you can do, and we already saw a little bit of this with the cell phone example, is think about your product not as an object, but think of it as a platform through which you can deliver a variety of applications and services that create unique experiences for your customers. And this, I think, is a more enduring way to escape this commodity trap with globalizing manufacturing, with global supply chains. ERP systems have gone global. Everybody understands total quality management and Six Sigma quality now. So some of the things that could differentiate you on manufacturing in the 1980s or 90s themselves have gone global and have been encoded in software, and so there's whole availability of expertise there that's everybody has access to. So where can you differentiate, where can you sustain your value added? I think this is where you can do it. So one of the ideas here is by bringing these services into your conceptions of your products and turning them into platforms, you can co-create with your customers. And I'll describe more about this in a minute, but openness in this process can allow you to get more specialization. And with that, when you build these platforms, don't restrict them only to yourselves, but use them to invite many others to invest and invent and innovate alongside you. And in a sense, the struggle we're going to see with platforms like Apple on the one hand, Android on the other, or Research in Motion BlackBerry on the third hand, if you have three hands, is a competition for the apps, for the developers, for the services that you can get. And each of these platforms has strengths. I think it was just announced yesterday that Android has now overtaken Nokia's Symbian as the leading cell phone operating system by market share. And so Android has really come a long way in a short period of time. Even in the tablet area, where Apple with the iPad had a massive lead over everybody else, fueled by what? A cool device, but loads of applications and services sitting on top of iTunes and the Apps Store. But even there, the market share for Apple went from 95% to 75% in a 6-month period of time, with some of these tablets from Samsung and other companies using Android coming now and gaining momentum in the marketplace. So we're going to see a competition between platforms here, not between devices or handsets. Now, stepping back from products and these individual examples, you also see this at the level of the entire economies. There was a time, and this is I have to acknowledge my debt to our friends at IBM for this chart. Back in 1800, where was most of the workforce in the United States? Well, most of us were on farms. And most of what we ate was grown right around where we lived. The term for this is subsistence farming, basically. There was some trading in certain commodities, cotton and tobacco and a few others, but most of what people farmed and most of what people consumed was very, very local. Along comes the Industrial Revolution, and lo and behold, we turn into a manufacturing economy. In the early first half of the 20th century, some of the statisticians of the Department of Commerce said, okay, we've got agriculture, we've got all these manufactured goods, and we've got this other category. And that other category, which was kind of the residual for things that weren't agricultural or manufacturing, they decided to call that services. So that typology from the first half of the 20th century today is now the majority of the workforce activity in the United States. And it's forecast to get even more that way going forward. So the economy as a whole is moving toward more and more services as well. And it isn't just a US story. These are data on the top 10 countries in the world by the size of the labor force. And I won't make you look at all these numbers, but the main thing is to see in the percentage of the workforce in services, it's already either high and or it's growing very rapidly. So this is not a story for one country, one situation. This is happening globally. So having said this about services, hopefully I've whet your appetite and you're at least interested now in why we might care about innovation in services. Let me define my terms. One thing that I've noticed in talking to people about services is that many of us have kind of a low opinion of the term services. It doesn't have a lot of prestige in Japan, for example. I think when I talk about my parents, they seem to think about like a nail salon or a barber shop or something. And it's like, that's the basis of 21st century prosperity? Something's not right. And indeed, the root of the word actually comes out of the Latin for slavery. So it doesn't sound like a very promising way to innovate for the future. But happily, those same statisticians in the Department of Commerce use a different definition of services. And it's the definition that's behind those data that you saw a couple of slides ago. A service is the change in the condition of a person or a good belonging to some economic entity brought about as a result of the activity of some other economic entity with the approval of the first person or entity. So that's the definition of services here. So this gets a little tricky, for example. So if you brought your lunch with you today to campus and you ate it, you did not participate in the service economy. You did that all on your own. But if you went into the cafe here and you bought a sandwich and ate that instead, you actually did participate in the service economy. So those two things would be measured differently. Now you're still eating a sandwich, so it sounds a little bit arbitrary, but this is how services are counted, are these kinds of transactions between entities. Oh, sorry, too fast. And here's where I show my other debt to my friends from IBM. That migration of economic activity from agriculture and manufacturing towards services is being mirrored in some of the leading corporations around the world as well. And this was actually brought home to me in a conversation that I had with one of Jean-Paul's colleagues, Paul Horn, who at the time was the senior vice president for all of IBM's research organization around the world. And Paul was responsible for about 3,000 researchers, and I think it was 7 laboratories around the world. And we had a wonderful conversation, and at the end of it, I asked him, well, what's your biggest problem? Not knowing what he was going to say, but what he told me I thought was really insightful. He said, gee, IBM by 2004 was getting more than half of its revenue from IBM Global Services. Meanwhile, he's got a staff of 3,000 researchers, and hardly any of them were doing anything to contribute to the revenue streams of IBM Global Services. So you see the problem here? If you want to sustain a research organization over time, you better be relevant to the revenue streams that pay the wages of those 3,000 researchers. And he knew that this was not a sustainable situation, but he hadn't really worked out what he should do about it. And I thought, this is a kind of a nice way in a microcosm to think about the problem I was showing you here. You know, this is what IBM's doing, but its research staff are acting as though the world is still dominated by goods. And he needs to find a way to get the IBM researchers thinking about services as well. So this idea of how do you innovate in services got really interesting for me after that conversation. And one of the things that I realized as I thought about it is, although there is a debate about this in the academic literature, it's my view that having looked at it, they aren't the same thing. And why is that? Well, part of this goes back to Michael Porter. How many of you here are familiar with Michael Porter? Okay, I know I'm talking to a lot of folks from the engineering side. So Michael Porter, for those of you who don't know him, is a very, very well-regarded professor from Harvard Business School who wrote some of the seminal texts on competitive strategy. His first book in 1980 was called Competitive Strategy, and then his second book was called Competitive Advantage, and so on. And he really became, I would say, one of the leading, if not the leading, writer about how businesses can get and sustain competitive advantage in the marketplace. And what I'm showing you here is a diagram from his second book, Competitive Advantage, which was published in 1985. And this idea of a value chain shows that how products flow into an inbound logistics function. They get operated on, they get sent outside, transferred to marketing and sales, services is added, and out they go to the market. And then there are a variety of overhead functions to support these activities, from procurement to R&D, human resources, and so on. Now, if you notice that service is right here at the end, it's kind of the last thing in the value chain here before it goes to the marketplace. And the real message of Porter's books is the way you win in the market is either through being the lowest cost competitor or having the most differentiated product or having some sort of specialized niche. And those were your three general choices to make to get and sustain competitive advantage. And you basically did this through your products. This is a very product-centered view of how businesses are going to make money. And service is kind of the last thing you do before you sell it to the customer. So when you go and you buy it at the store salesperson asks you, do you want to get a warranty with that? Or something like that. If you're buying a new car, they try to sell you stuff to cover the seats, you know, those special coatings, or if you want the extended service plan, or these kinds of things. But it's basically the last thing you do before you take possession of the product. And so the action in the world of Michael Porter is really all in the products. And that's, I think, why we have a view of innovation today that's really about products and technologies, and we really need to update that view towards services. So how might we do that? Well, I don't have the same graphical talents as whoever designed this for Porter, so if any of you feel graphically skilled and inspired to contribute something, I am totally open to a better representation of what I'm about to describe. PowerPoint is a pretty limited tool for drawing anyway. I'm pretty limited in my graphical abilities. So I will try to describe what I intend to say and welcome anybody who can improve its presentation. The idea of putting services, instead of at the very end of the process, to put services at the center of the process of innovation is what I'm trying to get at. And it's really about creating a unique experience for customers. And you have to engage with customers to do that. You want to invite them to co-create, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. One of the underpinnings of this is the importance of tacit knowledge, experiential knowledge that customers need or want to share with you so you can understand as their supplier what it is that they really would like to experience. You can then create some experience points that they can directly relate to and then craft offerings to bring customers to you, and so this would continue. These arrows are intended to convey this boundary of the firm, and these arrows are intended to say you do this not only on your own, but with a variety of others as well. So you put the customer at the center of this, and you bring the resources not only of the firm, but of the other people with you in doing this. So that's what I'm trying to say graphically. I'm not sure it succeeds, but that's what is intended here. Now, it's important to realize that this is not something that's new to me or even to this period of time. At the same time Michael Porter was sweeping the world with his views about competitive strategy, there were other people who actually had different views of the role of products. And so I'm going to sample two of these for you here. One is from a guy named Peter Drucker. And what he pointed out is that what the customer buys and considers value is never a product. It's always utility. That is what a product does for him. And if you actually dig into microeconomics and you look at a customer's demand function, customers are actually, in those functions, they're getting utility from the consumption. So they're not buying it for the thing itself, they're buying it for what it will do for them. And Ted Levitt, who was a marketing professor at Harvard, said it in a little simpler form. People don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. What they want is a 1/4-inch hole. But they can't get the hole without the drill. So they buy your drill to get the hole. So the idea is it's about utility, not about the product itself. So stepping back a little bit, I want to make an argument to you now that with a service kind of thinking about utility and service as opposed to products in the Michael Porter sense, we can actually construct an argument for why these markets might actually grow beyond the markets of just products themselves. So we'll start with our old friend Adam Smith, who, among other things, observed in the book The Wealth of Nations that growth and innovation were rooted in the division of labor. And he had this wonderful example of the pin factory, where he showed what I think were children actually, making pins in, I think it was 14 different steps in a manufacturing process, at the end of which you had these little pins you could use for sewing. And you would think a pin's a pretty simple object, but yet it had 14 discrete steps to make it. And because they had broken it into 14 discrete steps, they were able to make them very fast, very efficiently, very cheaply. And so the idea was it's through taking this task, breaking it into its subcomponents, and then really specializing well in those, you can actually get tremendous economies by doing this through specialization. And this is the source of where innovation comes from, according to Adam Smith. Now, another guy in the middle of the 20th century named George Stigler built on top of this. And he said, yeah, you know, division of labor is really important. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. But the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. You can't do a huge division of labor if you've only got a small market to serve. So conversely, you need a big market in order to be able to justify those investments in extended divisions of labor. And then our own Oliver Williamson, who's on our faculty over at the business school and actually shared the Nobel Prize in the fall of 2009, built on Ronald Coase saying that economic activity will move inside the firm wherever the transaction costs of using the market exceed those of using the firm. For our purposes, the vice versa is actually more relevant. Economic activity will move outside the firm whenever the transaction costs of using the firm exceed those of using the market. So we've got these building blocks. So let's put those pieces together now. With specialization, you can influence those transaction costs. You can actually make it more efficient to do something in the market rather than doing it inside yourself. So for those of you making your sandwiches and eating them here, you were doing it yourself. But for those of you buying the sandwiches here, if we can make those sandwiches cheaply enough and efficiently enough, we might actually get you to come here and eat your sandwich rather than making your own from home. If we do this, we can actually tip firms to take service activities into the market out of what they were doing on their own. And that in turn would allow us to extend the division of labor. I'm going to have an example of this in just a minute about payroll processing, a company called Paychex. And this creates a powerful source of organic growth for services firms. This is, I think, the payoff for thinking about innovation in services in this fashion. You can actually unlock more revenue by doing this. So just to make it more visual for you, we start with Adam Smith. We get more specialization, more economies of scale. Things get cheaper. Then we go to Oliver Williamson and say, well, gee, if you make it cheap enough, firms will actually go out into the market instead of doing it themselves. If they go out into the market, that increases the market size. Larger market size means, hey, we can invest more in the division of labor, and around we go again. You see how these threads connect? So this is, I think, the reason why it's worth paying attention to innovation in services in this kind of a way. So now here's paychecks. So none of you are old enough to remember, but there was a time not all that long ago where companies did their own payroll. Everybody had one or more payroll clerks. And if you were a big company, you might have even had senior payroll clerks who'd been around for a while and really knew what was going on. And that was how it was done. But with the advent of computing, brought about by our friends at IBM and others, there were companies who in the 1960s began to buy computers and offer payroll processing services to their customers. And in those days, not every company could afford to buy a mainframe computer, so the early markets were for customers who couldn't afford to have their own mainframe. They could buy a service from a Paychex. Paychex would do the payroll processing for them. Now, by itself, you think, okay, but along comes the PC, and suddenly everybody can afford computers. So it could have gone right back into the company again, right? Because everybody's got a computer. You can do your own payroll. But guess what? It didn't work out that way. While PCs did become ubiquitous and computing power became very, very cheap, payroll became more and more specialized. And people like Paychex began to get better and better at doing it. Because you not only have to deal with all the various withholdings, specialized accounts, all the different vacation and sick leave policies, and differences between state and local regulations and different environments. There's a lot of complexity to it. And these guys, once they lost their advantage in just terms of sheer computing, access to high-powered computing, they made up for it with these knowledge advantages of just really being specialized and expert at doing it. And they had something else going for them too. If you work at Paychex and you really understand this stuff well, you can have a long career in the company. Maybe rise to the very highest levels of the organization. By contrast, if you do this job well at another company, you could maybe rise to senior payroll clerk. And where did you go from there? There's nowhere else to go. Or you have to leave it and go into some other finance responsibility entirely. And somebody else has to get trained to do it. So you could have different career paths with these more specialized providers that you couldn't have in the other general companies. So ironically, even small companies today, and almost every large company I know, nobody does their payroll. Everybody has somebody else doing their payroll for them. Even though it might seem like an easy thing for you to do, this has become an industry that 50 years ago didn't exist. So it's one example of these service economies creating new markets. Now there's something else going on here too. It's not just spreading the fixed costs of a mainframe computer over more customers. Another fundamental underpinning of this is something I think of as the utilization advantage. So how many of you here have a car, own a car? Come on, get those hands up nice and high. Okay, more than half of you, all right? Now, you own it, you bought it, you insure it, you have to maintain it. Around here you have to park the damn thing, which is not cheap in Berkeley. You got all the costs of this vehicle. And if you're like me and you're the one who uses the car, you have the following problem. Let's say I drive 12,000 miles a year, and given my combination of city and highway driving, let's say I average 30 miles an hour when I'm doing my driving. Well, that's 400 hours of operation a year. Well, meanwhile, we've got 8,760 hours in a year. So I'm driving my car for less than 5% of the hours in the year. So I've got 100% of the costs and I'm using it less than 5% of the time. This is what the utilization differential is about. If I thought about my transportation as a service rather than as a car, that unused capacity could be the basis for a very different kind of a business. So all these costs that I'm currently bearing all by myself could be shared with others if I can somehow share the utilization with others. Now you can think of this in a number of dimensions. You can think about leasing a car rather than buying it. So you basically get the leasing company to front you the money, and then you pay them back over time. There's the old model of the taxi, which is a transportation service. There's even enterprise car rental that comes out and picks you up. And then there's the zip car, where you basically are buying it by the trip. And depending on which one you choose, how the vehicle is selected, how it's delivered, how it's maintained, how you operate it, how you pay for it, how you protect it, these things vary by the mode of transportation service that you use. There's even a new one out. How many of you have heard of this, Daimler's Car2Go? This is a very new thing, and it's just experimental at this stage, so I'm not saying this is going to be a success. But what they've done here is they've included a GPS in every car so that you know where the car is at all times. And so instead of having to go to like a zip car, where you have to go to a specific place to pick it up, you can just look up the GPS location of the car on a map and go get it. And then you can leave it wherever you want when you're done with it. So it's pretty convenient from a consumer's perspective. This is being tested in 2 places right now, best of my understanding, in Germany and in Texas. The nice thing is they've made it very flexible for consumers. You can pick it up or drop it off wherever you want. There's no upfront commitment, no security deposit, all the rest of that. It's a very, very flexible way of thinking about a transportation service. And it wouldn't be possible without the GPS element and then the ability then to use network maps to be able to find these things, both for you as a consumer and then for them to make sure they know where it is when they need to deal with it or maintain it. Different kind of service innovation comes from UPS, United Parcel Service. In the old mode, UPS was one of the carriers to send your packages from a customer. So the customer would do some operations, would have some things they want to ship out, and then they'd pick whatever carrier they wanted to do. Well, UPS, a couple years ago, created a new offering. In a way, it's a little bit like what IBM did with IBM Global Services. UPS said, we will be your shipping department if you let us. We'll take it over. We'll take your people, we'll put them on our payroll, we'll take your facilities, we'll operate them for you. So we'll still be right next to you, just like we were before, but now we'll take care of all that stuff for you. And by the way, we may still send it through UPS, and I suspect more stuff goes through UPS under this arrangement than it did before, just a guess. But they will sometimes use the other ones when it actually is a cheaper situation. But what's really interesting is after they do this, they actually see things in the customer's operations that they didn't see when they were out here. And one of the things that UPS is now doing, because it sees more deeply into the customer's operations, is they're actually working with some of their customers where they've done this to help them optimize their supply chain as well, and taking over a lot of the supply chain shipments, business that they weren't even participating in before. So it's an example where they have a lot more knowledge and much deeper customer interaction as a result of taking on more of the burden. So this might sound risky to you. Is UPS getting a good deal? Well, there is more risk if they don't perform, but they do get a lot of learning. And I think that's these learning economies that I think are really the powerful thing, because they can now make investments because they see much more clearly exactly what's driving their customers' demand for their services. And they can now actually even involve themselves in shaping and manipulating some of those in a way that they couldn't before when they were just a vendor. And this allows them to get more efficient, and by seeing into the processes that precede shipment, they can even offer new services that they wouldn't have realized would be necessary before. So some of the things that they do internally in their own operations turn out to be useful for their customers and their customers' operations as well. So these are new services that they can offer. So you not only do the things that you're doing today more efficiently, you can also begin to do new things that you didn't know about before. Now, that's UPS. What about UPS's customers? If UPS is getting a good deal, is somebody getting screwed here? Is this, how does this work out? Well, from the customer side, the first thing that happens, of course, is you free up some internal resources. If you're not competing on your ability to ship, and I think many companies don't compete on that, you might actually, by doing this kind of an arrangement, free up your resources to invest in things where you do win in the market on the basis of doing that well. And UPS, by virtue of its business, is just going to be a better shipper than just about all their customers. Because of the specialization, the career paths, just like the paychecks example, and because of the utilization differential and the ability to do more specialization, it's not a zero-sum game. UPS can actually deliver a better offer to its customers and still make more money itself because it can take advantage of these. So I don't think actually the customer is getting a bad deal here. Another one that you might enjoy more would be Amazon. How many of you buy on Amazon? Okay, just most of you. Yeah, me too. I'm addicted now. Well, Amazon does something really interesting in terms of economies of scope, the ability to do new things. When it got started back in 1994, it was Earth's largest bookstore. And if that's all they focused on today, they would be a much less important company than they are. They now sell a whole lot of different products. And what you see over here is the Amazon web store that they present to their third-party merchants. And what you do when you enroll in the web store and sign up for their programs, you get the same APIs and the same page design tools that Amazon uses internally for its own stuff. So if you go on the Amazon site and you're buying a book, well, you're getting that from Amazon. They buy the books, they stock them, they inventory them, and send them on to you and fulfill it. But if you go onto the Amazon site and buy jewelry, the web page just looks like another book page for an Amazon book, but the jewelry is actually not stocked or merchandised by Amazon. It's actually a third-party merchant that's doing that. So Amazon can add more and more merchandise without having to take on all the stocking and inventory risk of carrying these things themselves. And another clever thing about Amazon's model, when you think about it, is they always get your money first before they start incurring any costs. Nice trick if you can do it. Because among other things, this means that your growth, instead of making you invest in working capital to build these things in the product world, here we get the money first. And then we start organizing these services to fulfill you, but we've already got your money. So in the case of jewelry, Amazon still collects the money. And then the jewelry company fulfills the order, and Amazon pays the jewelry company. But of course, Amazon got the money first and has the use of the money until the jewelry company gets paid. So they get economies of scope without having to take on all those extra risks in doing it. But for the user, you get a consistent experience, so it feels very natural, just like you're buying books or other things from Amazon, which means that if you're like me, you start going to Amazon for more and more of your online shopping. And in the marketing term, they get more of your share of wallet. Customers buy more from Amazon. And because Amazon is one of the most highly trafficked sites for online shopping, that's where third-party merchants want to be. So it makes it more attractive for them to have their merchandise, to get more money from us, who get a consistent experience managed by Amazon. So all of this is economies of scope, but in a kind of a lightweight manner, because they don't have to take on all the heavy stocking and merchandising to do it. So it's a great example of doing new things. But Amazon is more than that. They also, I think, illustrate economies of scale nicely as well. As I said before, they've got one of the most highly trafficked sites out there, which means they have to have a huge server infrastructure to handle all this. And that's what I'm trying to show you here. These are like racks of servers processing all these transactions. Well, Michael Porter's strategy might say, keep that to yourself. This is one of your core differentiating advantages. You want to be the low-cost provider of these kinds of transaction processing services. This is one of your key advantages. But Amazon has said, no, you know what? We're going to make a business out of this, and we're going to let others use our infrastructure. And we're going to make a business out of it called Amazon Web Services. So any of you hosting stuff on Amazon Web Services? Okay. So what you can do is, the nice thing for Amazon again, this is this virtue of converting a fixed server farm to a variable cost instead. Instead of having to buy your own servers, hire your own people, get a facility, and do all that, Amazon does all that for you. Now, why does Amazon do that? Well, it increases their utilization. Now, why would that be good? Well, this is one of those areas where, thanks to Moore's law, next year those servers are going to be cheaper. They're going to be faster. They're going to consume lower power. So the more you use now, the more you add, the better and newer your infrastructure becomes. So this wouldn't necessarily work in every situation, but in a case like this, it's really clever, and it gets them way far ahead of their competitors. You know, how do you compete against something like that? If you're Barnes & Noble or Borders, they've thrown up their hands. They don't even try to compete with that now. But there are people in this business against them now, but they're companies like Microsoft, Google, IBM, and then some smaller companies like Rackspace and a few others. So here's a book retailer that's now a web services provider. So I'm sure 16 years ago they had no idea they were going to be doing this when they got started. But it's a very powerful way to accelerate their economies of scale and keep them out ahead of their competitors. So this actually is a nice illustration of something from my 2006 book, which is about business models and how they evolve over time. Now the idea here comes out of that Carnegie Mellon software methodology of maturity. And the idea is that, you know, even software can indeed be managed, which was the idea of the Carnegie Mellon maturity model. What I'm doing is adapting it to business models. And so here's how this works. Every company has some kind of a business model. Most of them have a pure, undifferentiated, or commodity kind of a business model. So they don't really think about it very much because there's really nothing special about it. The problem with an undifferentiated model is you typically have to sell on your costs rather than on anything else. A better business model is something where you can begin to differentiate what you have. Now you can price on your value rather than on your cost. The problem I see here, though, is the things that generated the differentiation themselves are not always sustainable. And this can give rise to a lot of what I think of as one-hit wonders. Startups in Silicon Valley, they have a hit product and then they can't sustain it or come up with a new one. Or think of music groups that had one hit song and they got that song kind of broke through, but then nothing ever came after it. Or authors who wrote one book and then that's all they ever did. How you can do better than that is if you can begin to segment. So you can sell not only a differentiated product, maybe you can also sell a volume product for a mass market. So because you can segment between different segments of the model, your market, you can actually get more value and profit out of the entire market. So these would be improved business models, but they're ones that are still doing it on your own resources. A way you can step up from that is to begin to open your business models to take advantage of external technologies and ideas in your business, and to step up beyond that to be somebody who can actually make money both bringing things into your organization and letting things go outside to other organizations, such that your business model is integrated across both the inside and the outside. And you're equally adept and comfortable making money all these different ways. Now, you might stop there and think, gee, that sounds pretty good. How could you do better than that? But I think there is one model that is better than that I call the platform business model. And the key distinction between step 5 and step 6 is that in the platform, other companies invest their own money in products and services that make your stuff more valuable. So it's like a value multiplier. So a quick example here is that Kleiner Perkins has which is a venture capital firm here in Silicon Valley. They have a $200 million fund called the I Fund. And like it sounds, the I Fund is for supporting startups building things for the iPod, iTunes, iPhone, iPad, whatever. So this is professionally managed money dedicated to supporting companies who are going to do things that make Apple's franchise more valuable. That's the distinction between step 5 and step 6. When other people think it's a good investment decision to do things that support your platform, you've arrived at a level 6 platform model. That's the most valuable business model I can think of. So if you guys can think of a better one, let's talk in the Q&A about that. So let's think about this in the context of services. How can you sustain differentiation? One of the things that's also held services back, I think, is the sense that, gee, there's not much intellectual property that protects services. And these experiences you talk about can be observed by others, and then you can recreate or reproduce those. So what's to stop you from copying them? And so even if you come up with something, how do you avoid just being ripped off or copied or what have you? And I think this idea of a platform in that level 6 model is a nice answer to that. Let me first argue that platforms can be thought of as multi-sided markets. Because to get somebody to want to put professional capital to invest in you, a lot of things have to have happened. You have to have developers that want to be there. There have to be customers that want to buy it. And these things take time to build. And your technologies in the platform become the basis for others' technologies and innovations. And by doing this, you can actually help shape where this is going. And that ability to shape this, to be the system architect, is a very subtle but very, very powerful source of value added. And that, I think, is how you can sustain this differentiation, even though these things are true. So a couple of quick examples of unlikely platforms. One is going to be in one of the most low-tech service businesses you can think of, which is restaurants. This is the restaurant in Catalonia in Spain called El Bulli. And what you see here is a nice, beautiful foam sitting on a cube of, I think that's dry ice. So this is a taste sensation. The idea is that it's a very, very light, almost evanescent kind of a taste. So El Bulli is actually, I think, a platform, because this guy, Ferran Adria, who is the proprietor of the place, studies this idea of cuisine that you saw there called molecular gastronomy. And in a very open innovation way, he doesn't invent this. He actually discovers it working with a French physical chemist. But he recognizes its value. He contributes to the research and brings it to the restaurant, El Bulli. Off of this restaurant, which is now regarded by many as one of the best restaurants in the world, they've also launched these other business partnerships with other companies. This is a restaurant becoming essentially a brand that licenses with other things. So with this company Borges, there are some co-branded oils and snacks. With Lavazza for coffee, NH Hoteles, which is a hotel chain in Spain, even the Spanish airline. So this is a company that is in the restaurant business on the one hand, but because of its reputation, it's actually been able now to create these co-branding deals with others in other areas that virtually all restaurants can't get near any of this. So it's an odd example, but it's a platform in a very unlikely industry. For those of you from the engineering side, I thought of you for this one because this is a little more technical, maybe more interesting for you. And this is 50 years of semiconductor history in one slide. Again, you aren't old enough to remember this, but there was a time when in order to build chips, you had to build the entire system into which the chip went, because there weren't clear interface standards between the chip on the one hand and the system that the chip went into on the other. Along the 1960s, and actually Intel was one of the drivers of this, they actually started to be enough standardization, particularly in the IBM mainframe memory market, and that's where Intel's first chips went, to create something called the integrated device manufacturer model, where you could design chips for other companies' systems, because this had gotten stabilized and standardized enough that you could design chips for it. So the IDM manufacturers in the late 60s really started to take off. Well, then in the 1980s, over in Taiwan, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation invents a new model, the foundry model, where manufacturing becomes a service. The chip designers bring a design to TSMC. TSMC manufactures the design, gives the wafers back to the chip companies, who then sell them into the systems. So this separation of design from manufacturing emerges with TSMC in the 1980s. And then just in the last couple of years, TSMC has announced, and these are their words, not mine, their TSMC Open Innovation Platform. And what this is about is a further specialization here, where some of the intellectual property for the reference designs, for the manufacturing processes, some of the design tools, et cetera, are all managed and tested. And if you follow the validated IP from either TSMC itself or third parties in the Open Innovation Platform, TSMC will certify you'll get a yield first time through the chip design. So they do the certification and testing and validation to support that. So it's a very powerful platform, not only for TSMC's manufacturing services, but increasingly for the intellectual property that supports the deeper specialization to design and build these chips. Oh, I think I may have already said some of this. One thing to say about this is that TSMC has about more than half of the market share in terms of foundry capacity out there. And that's actually very interesting for this kind of a model, because if you are a third-party designer of new design tools or new process methodologies, TSMC is the first one you want to go to, because they're more than half of the market. So it's another example where here the big get bigger over their competitors. And another way you can sustain this advantage over time over your competitors. And it's really hard for competitors, I think, to overcome this. So again, this idea that you can't build competitive advantage in services, I think this is another example where I think they've got a very strong competitive advantage in what has become a service business. So these are some of the concepts in the book overall. Open services innovations at the center of this. Some of the things we talked about earlier about utilization and platforms are in one of the chapters. There's another chapter on working closely with customers and co-creation. There's more about being open and inviting others in and letting your stuff go out to others, and how that promotes more participation, more economies of scope and scale, and the importance of being the system integrator to bring these pieces all together. And then the impacts on your business model by doing this, and trying to create those platform business models that are really at the top of the evolutionary process of business models. So I think this is my last slide, and with that we can take some questions or comments. And I think because we're trying to tape this, I just ask you to try to use the microphone so we can get your question as well. So thoughts, questions?
All right.
Hi, Professor Chesbrough. This is Antoine. I have a question. Do you think that this new shift toward services is a way for the US to compete against rising powers in Asia, like China, who are more focused on products?
I think this is going to be so the question is about competing against the rising economies. I think this is going to be necessary not only for the US, but I think it's going to be for all the high-wage economies today. I think this will be necessary for everybody. But yes, I think there is a debate now going on about reviving US manufacturing. And if by reviving we mean going back to some time in the 1960s where we had these big vertically integrated steel mills or big long supply chains for the automotive sector, I think those things are going to be very unsuccessful, in part because of the widely dispersed useful knowledge all over the world, and it's a big mistake to try to avoid that. In fact, it's something you want to take advantage of. Where I think you win in the global economy is being able to put those pieces together and then to wrap these other services around it so that you deliver more satisfaction and more value to your customers. So in that way, yes, I do think you can sustain high wage employment in countries like the US, but also France and other places too.
Thank you.
So if I could ask a follow-on to that, what are the implications for a labor force? Because if you think of your graph over time, right, subsistence agriculture requires almost no skills. Working in a factory requires a moderate level of skills, and often working in a service economy is a knowledge worker. So what do you do with a bunch of 40-year-old payroll clerks? And how does a nation transform itself to be able to do that? Not just over the long haul, which requires presumably investment in education, but even in the short term.
Yeah, that's a great question about the workforce impact. This is an environment of more, returns to education, no question. And so there is a requirement, I think, for more investment and really lifelong learning as well. It's not only a 40-year-old payroll clerk, but a 55-year-old mechanical engineer. Where we still have a lot of skills and talent there, but maybe the skill set's no longer what it needs to be. One of the things that I actually see in a lot of companies is that the service function is often a very low status function in the company. Sometimes the services are managed as a cost center, and the idea is to try to minimize the amount of money you have to spend on services to try to placate your customers and keep them from bothering you too much. And so these people are not destined for rapid advancement in the company, nor are they getting paid all that much money. And I think that's a shift we have to make as well, that these people who can engage well with customers, who can listen well, and then the system architects who can bring out these platforms and find ways to bring others in and build on top of them, marshal things that go to the outside, those kinds of careers and skills become even more valuable, and they're often not well recognized in companies too. So there's a general workforce problem that you mentioned, and then there's a more specific one where we've got to create stronger career paths and career ladders for people that really build on these services ideas. Right next to him.
I'm wondering, what are the tools to actually enable open services innovation? Technology obviously is the immediate answer, but are there other means like pricing strategies or distribution models in order to kind of build the customer experience?
Yeah, I think a couple of ones. A lot of equipment, for example, these days takes advantage of very low-cost sensor technology. And with sensors, you can often learn things that 20 years ago equipment suppliers couldn't really effectively know and therefore couldn't manage. For example, the operating temperatures that the equipment's being used in, the amount of hours a day or a week that the equipment's running, are they operating within normal parameters for pressure or for humidity or other concerns. And with these sensors, you can actually offer new services to your customer where we say, we will help you keep your equipment up and running all the time. And with our sensors and with the experience we have from previous breakdowns, we can do preventive or even predictive maintenance so the equipment is serviced before it ever goes down. And that way you don't lose any of the work in process going through the equipment. So the supplier can now become much more of a partner rather than just in the old days, it gets off the pallet off of the truck, and then the customer installs it, and it's up to the customer, and we hope they'll buy our spare parts. Now we're doing a lot more with the customer and for the customer, and because we make the equipment, we know more about that equipment in all of our customers than any one of our customers is ever going to know. So we learn a lot faster when the equipment's likely to fail, what the leading causes of failure are, and with some additional work we can then learn how to anticipate and intervene before the equipment fails so we can actually sell uptime instead of selling equipment. Because what customers really want is they want uptime on the equipment. And they, up until now, they had to buy the equipment and then work to get it to run on their own. But with these new technology contributors, we can actually, as their supplier, do a lot more with and for them than we could before. Is that helpful?
If I understood you correctly, this platform idea is a very key part of what you're saying. But is it as simple as just putting out a platform there as a company? And we've seen this multiple times with Apple that it works fine. But what would you say are the key parameters that lead to success and really that people use and contribute applications or whatever to this platform?
Well, no question Apple's had great success, but Nokia with Symbian also has a platform. It's not going so well. So it's not the case that just saying you have a platform means you're destined for success. I think there are a lot of specific reasons why Symbian's had trouble. Among them are it was not really designed to be shared with others and have others code off of it. I think it was intended to be kind of an internally managed piece of software, which then got caught up in some of these competitive forces, and so they eventually went to open source Symbian. And when people looked at the code, it wasn't like Linux or something else that had these modular components, and so you could kind of mix and match and plug in. It was this hairball piece of code that, yeah, it was open source, but it was a hairball. So these things platforms have to be architected for use not just by yourself, but for others to use too. And then you have to develop software development kits, you have to develop reference designs, there are a lot of other things you have to build on top of it to get people into using your platform. One of the things I think that hurt Microsoft in the 1990s is that they were really on a roll with their Windows platform, but Windows itself was a real hairball piece of code as well. Meanwhile, in the computer science departments around the country, people were learning Linux, and which is a much tighter, more elegant, and much more easily worked with piece of code. And so you have a whole generation of computer scientists trained on code that wasn't Microsoft. So these things that undergird a platform are often quite subtle. So the role of architecting these things is actually quite important. Then there's the business side too. You have to then go explain to people not just how to use the code in a technical sense, but what are the business benefits? What are you going to do for them? How are you going to help them find customers? So Apple's App Store has a very simple answer to this. All the apps developers get 70% of the revenues. Apple keeps 30%. If you actually go through the process of trying to build and sell your stuff, if you had to pay 30% for your distribution costs and collecting the money and all the rest, that's a pretty good deal that Apple's giving the developers. So the fact that Apple's only keeping 30% and giving away 70% is a very compelling business side to this platform idea. So you've got to think about both the technical sides and the business sides as you build these platforms.
Thank you, Professor Hennry. I think that the business model platform is different from the platform business model. Yes, I think that is quite different. I want to know the content about the value proposition, revenue sharing, and key resources and process in your platform business model, especially the architecture and the modular content of this 4 contents. Thank you.
So this question rightly points out that In my 2006 book, I actually have a 6-point definition of business models, which include the elements that you just mentioned. And I guess your question is now to ask me to explicate them here as well. And I'm not sure if my memory will allow me to do that because I didn't prepare that for this. But it is in the 2006 book there in chapter 5. So I'm not sure if I can remember it all, but there were a list of criteria for each of the 6 points in the business model, and for stage 1 versus 2, 2 versus 3, 3 versus 4, 4 versus 5, 5 versus 6. On each of these 6 points, there were differentiating criteria for all of them. So I did go through that exercise and work it out, but I didn't bring it in my brain with me here this afternoon. So I'm going to have to direct you there to give you the details on that. But thank you for the question.
Any more questions? Oh, one more.
Good afternoon. I was wondering about the idea of financial services. And it seems like a lot of the service in the world we see right now is of that category. And I'm wondering if you see a distinction between that and technical services and the ability for, open innovation to work in financial services.
Yeah, there's actually a guy named Daniel Fosnacht who wrote a dissertation that he subsequently published, and the publication of his dissertation is called Open Innovation in Financial Services. So I actually have borrowed some of his material with his permission in the current book. And one of the things that he talks about that I thought was very interesting is for those of us who were individual investors, there were a long time ago when you wanted to buy stocks, you would call a broker, and it would probably be, there was always a commission added to your price, and the commission could be 6%, 7% of the trade. So if you're buying $2,000 worth of stock, it might be $140 just in the commission. So pretty expensive. And then the Charles Schwab and the first generation discount brokerage firms came in, and they sold the stocks for, I think it was $29.95 per trade, up to 100 shares or something like that. And it really engendered a conflict in the business models of these brokerage firms, like the Merrill Lynch or the Goldman Sachs or the other ones, because they weren't engineered to be doing really, really low-cost, high-volume trades with retail customers. Like the discount brokerage firms were. So what do they do to respond? And they do go through a few iterations of response, but the thing that they hit on eventually was an asset management model, where instead of charging you per trade, they would charge you typically 1% of your assets under management with them. So if you had a portfolio of, let's say, $1 million with them, they would charge you $10,000 per year, and you could make all the trades you wanted, or no trades. And part of the pressure from before is that the broker is getting commissioned on trades. Guess what? They have lots of ideas for you to make trades all the time. Whether you really should or not, or whether the ideas were very good or not, they were always motivated to kind of get you to trade. And then this became known as churn. Well, with this asset management model, it's like, well, whether you trade or not, I don't make any more or less money. What I really want you to do is I want you to be able to grow your assets, because if your assets grow from 1 million to 2 million, I still make 1%. So now it's, I make a lot more money. So in a sense, you're more on the same side of the table because of that different mechanism. Now, there are still some residual problems because the brokerage firm asset managers are still also distribution channels for some of the financial products out of these companies. So if they come up with a new kind of an offer, like an IPO, for example, for a company, and they want to sell the shares to all that retail investor network out there, your broker might be calling you and saying, hey, you really want to grab some of this hot new company coming out, and he's doing that maybe because he thinks it's good for you. He may be doing it because somebody's giving him a lot of motivation and some money to kind of push this stock on his accounts. So there still are these conflicts of interest and stuff. And one of the things about financial services that I've come to learn is it really helps to understand the business model of who you're doing business with. How do they make money? How do they get compensated? And I think the ethical ones will tell you. how they make money, how they get compensated. Then you still have to exercise your judgment about whether it's in your interests or not. And then when somebody comes to you with an offer like that, if you understand what are all the contextual factors motivating them to present that offer to you, you can then say yay or nay with a little more, your eyes open, so to speak.
Seems like ethics is part of your open innovation. It can be tough in that environment.
Well, one thing that people have noticed is that for these kinds of collaborations to sustain over time, there is a level of trust that has to be built and then maintained. And so in a dynamic world, if you are a bad actor and you sort of take advantage of somebody, that will get around, and you might get a short-term advantage from that. But in a dynamic world where a lot of things are changing rapidly, if that gets around and fewer people want to deal with you, and you're then cutting yourself off from this wellspring of lots of possibilities and opportunities, it actually, I think, hurts you in the long run to get that kind of a reputation.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Thank you so much. Should we give him a hand? All right. Thank you.